All right. We are pretty much finished with chapter 3, so we're going to quickly just look at the end of chapter 3 here and get into chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes. We've been studying how that Solomon, at the end of his life, has observed and learned lessons both from his own experiences as well as from observation regarding the priorities that man should have, lest his life be what Solomon himself defined as vanity, grasping after the wind, or in other words, pointless. What would be the point of everything under the sun is the phrase that Solomon uses when he describes the mortal physical life. What would be the point of anything? What would be the purpose behind it? All the labor that we do, it just gets passed on to another when we die. Everything that comes, joy, sorrow, everything from chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, a time for this, a time for that. All of these experiences when we die, if there's nothing other than that, what is the point of it? And this is why he keeps flipping back and forth between the perspective of under the sun, or the mortal life, and the perspective of one that is spiritual, one that considers that which is to come after this life. And that's why he puts together such a compelling argument for having the proper perspective, the proper priorities in life, so that we don't get so bogged down in the physical things that are happening from week to week, day to day, that we forget really what our purpose is to be. So here in verse 20, he's comparing animals to humans, and he says, in the end, man has no advantage over an animal, in that both of them die. And under the sun, they're both flesh. All go to one place, verse 20. All are from the dust and all return to dust. Verse 21 is where he delves into the difference. He says, who knows the spirit of the sons of men which goes upward and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth? In other words, when an animal dies, that's it. That spirit doesn't go. There's no eternal spirit for an animal. But for a human being, there is. That's what sets us apart. The fact that we have a soul, a spirit. God has enabled us with that soul and spirit to be able to reason, to have a trainable conscience, to understand right and wrong. So verse 21 is not a question of who knows if man has a spirit versus an animal. His point is that from a physical under the sun perspective, you look at an animal, you look at a human, they're both flesh, and when they die, you don't see some ethereal motion or ethereal movement or spirit rise up out of that body. So who knows where the spirit is in man? But God knows, and that man has a spirit. Where your spirit is, you can't tell. Science can't say. But what Solomon is observing is that who can see this? Who can observe the spirit? Well, no one can. But this is the difference that sets man apart from an animal. Verse 22, so I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Which is to say, enjoy the works, the fruits of your labor, according to the will of God, now. Okay, live for the present. Don't live in the past, and you get bogged down in perhaps glory of the past, or for that matter, mistakes of the past. Don't get bogged down in what's come before you. Don't get so bogged down in the future that you're constantly storing up for later, and you're not actually living for now. And that really, in a lot of ways, is the perspective of Solomon, is make the most of now. Because now is when we serve God. We don't serve God in the past. We don't serve God in the future. We serve God in the present. And the decisions that will ultimately define our judgment at the judgment day are the decisions we make now. We can't say it's the decisions of the future because we may not have a future. We may not have 5 minutes from now. It's not the decisions of the past because we can always change. We can always repent and turn to God if we've made mistakes in the past. It's the decisions now. And so when Solomon says, that nothing is better than a man should rejoice in his own works. That is his heritage under the sun. That is his heritage. Which is to say, this is really all man has in the now, under the sun, to rejoice in your works, because you don't know the future. You don't know what the future holds. You don't know if you're going to be here to see it. And so as a result, make now matter. All right, anything through chapter 3. We pretty much covered most of that last class. Chapter 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and in verse 1, Solomon says, I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who were already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Every now and then, usually several times we have so far throughout these first 3 chapters, there have been those moments where you just kind of go, wow, thanks, Solomon. That is a very encouraging thought you have there. Thus, verse 2, I praise the dead who were already dead. And then especially verse 3, better than both is he who has never existed. But what Solomon's describing, once again, what's the phrase, verse 1? Under the sun. Okay, this is what helps us delineate, and a lot of times, the context dictates it also, but most of the time when he is delineating between observations of mortality, of the flesh, of just in this world, he uses this phrase, under the sun. So when he returned, he considered all the oppression. So when he says, I returned, it's the concept that he keeps visiting these different aspects of wisdom that he has learned, either by experience or by observation. And so when he returns, the idea it's he returned in his mind. Okay, he's already gone over several different aspects in these first 3 chapters, and a common thread of them, obviously, is the difference of the mortal flesh and only the perspective of the mortal flesh versus one who seeks to serve God while on this earth. That is the main difference, and that's the theme that goes all the way through chapter 12. But what he says in verse 1 here, he says, I returned and considered all the oppression. So here's another aspect of man's life that we either observe or experience firsthand as human beings. So when he says, look, the tears of the oppressed, define who he might be considering as oppressed. What types of categories of people would we consider oppressed? Okay, those of low social caste, servants, slaves. A lot of times poor because of that social status or lack thereof that goes with it. A lot of times they find themselves in those types of situations. Typically, it's what Solomon has under consideration here is not oppression of life. Does, quote unquote, oppression of life, does that come to the rich and the poor? Sure. Does it come to the old and the young? Sure. Oppression of life is nothing but of man's influence, but rather just things that take place, happens in life. What Solomon has under consideration is man's influence with regard to oppression. And of course, Solomon is in a unique position in that he's a king. I don't think anybody would ever suggest that he himself had ever been oppressed because, he was the wisest man who ever lived. He was extremely wealthy and extremely powerful. So I doubt there was ever an occasion where he would have considered himself oppressed. But he was able, and this is part of the reason why he calls himself really more of a wise man Solomon than speaking as King Solomon. Because that's the very thing that somebody in their head, if they were looking at this from the perspective of, well, King Solomon, how can you possibly talk about oppression? You don't know what oppression is. So that's why Solomon is speaking outside of his kingship. He's speaking as a wise man, objectively viewing the different states that man goes through in this life. One of those is oppression here in verse 1. I consider all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. Which is to say, what does he mean by they have no comforter? Sorry?
They have nobody to be comfortable with, or they're not with the situation.
Okay, and nobody to help them through that situation. Yeah, huh? No relief, nobody to hold them, to uplift them. We talk about comforting, but a lot of times in that same vein would be to deliver them even. Not just to help them through that oppression, but to deliver them from that oppression, right? And so that idea that he mentions here at the end of verse 1, on the side of their oppressors, so here's the individuals, here are the human beings that are doing the oppressing, there is power, but they have no comforter. Was he talking about those in power there at the end of verse 1? He's talking about the oppressed. Neil?
Do you ever get into the legal system, like the state of Texas, United States legal system? Just my family been through a couple ugly divorces, and then what happened with my dad. It's people that, so as a Christian trying to play inside the guidelines of what you read in the New Testament, how you're supposed to conduct yourselves, when people don't play inside of Scripture, play inside of a moral compass, you can be oppressed real quickly. And you can be beat up real quickly in the legal system through appeals, through things where you have no power and you're just spending money. And then getting into verse 2, I mean, I know people very close to me who said, I'm ready to be done with this. I mean, they had the faith that they were going to be saved, and they said things had gotten so bad and the oppressed, they felt like they were being oppressed, and they were ready, hey, there is no justice. We're not going to win this. In the end, you might win, but you're going to be
at what cost?
Yeah, I mean, in reality, you're not going to win.
Yeah.
And so, through his eyes as the king, he probably saw that. Where, yes, we have a great judicial system because there's freedoms, but then there's ways to get abused when you're trying to play inside the lines and then other people are outside the lines. Yeah,
that's a good point, is that there's, in addition to the other types of oppression, there's moral oppression, for one thing, but then there's people who abuse the system that's in place, and because they have the means or they know the right people, they play outside the rules, and as a result, they can oppress us. And that's certainly other types of oppression that I hadn't thought about, so that certainly adds into this categories. So when he says on the side of their oppressors there is power. Okay, so here's the two categories of people. You've got those oppressed and the oppressors. The oppressors have the power, whatever that power may be, whatever that leverage may be, whether it's status, money, friends in high places. Okay, whatever the source of that ability to oppress, wherever it comes from, they have the power, but he says at the end of verse 1, but they have no comfort. He's not talking about the powerful, although I would suggest that from a more spiritual perspective, certainly they don't have a comforter, but he still has in mind the oppressed. These individuals have no comforter. They have power, the ones who are oppressing, they have power. And so from a human perspective, and keep in mind, under the sun, can power be a comforter from a human perspective? Having much money, can that be a comfort? Can having influence, knowing people who are in places of authority, can that be a comfort? But typically, do the oppressed, under the sun, do the oppressed have those types of comforts? They don't. And so what Solomon says is the oppressors have power. For whatever the source of that power may be, that is their comfort. And that's what they rely on, that's what they trust in. But the oppressed, they have no comforter. They have no power. They have no means to take care of themselves. They have no means to stand up for themselves or receive justice. And as a result, this is what he views. This is why he comes to verse 2, I praised the dead who were already dead more than the living who are still alive. Why?
The oppression is over for the dead.
Okay, notice there's a threefold category of people. One who is the least praised, or the least blessed for that matter, a middle category, and then a third category. Who is at the top of this that is the least praised or the least blessed from that perspective? Those who are still living. because they encounter this every day. Oppression of some kind or another, or having to observe that oppression, or, God forbid, being part of the oppressors. They have to live within those types of guidelines that society has set. So I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive, because it's over. And just as Neil mentioned, and I'm sure many of us have either ourselves experienced some point or have known loved ones at some point, either because of oppression, which again, this is man's influence on another, or because of disease or situation of life. They just, a lot of times maybe they pray that God will just, take me now, because I'm done. Maybe because of sorrow, maybe because of whatever. It's as if they're just, this life has zapped me of all energy, of everything that I have. And I've known people like that, especially in the midst of disease, where they pray daily that, whenever the Lord's ready to take me, I'm ready to go. And this is part of what Solomon is alluding to in the fact that the dead, they no longer have to deal with it. The living do. The dead have gotten past it. And again, he's speaking this from a human perspective. He's not speaking this as to the moral state or the spiritual state of grace that they may be in. He's not speaking to their judgment. He's simply speaking to their either living or dead. And if they've died, at least they don't have to deal with that. Either experiencing it, or as Solomon was doing. Remember what Solomon said, with what much wisdom there is much. Remember? With much wisdom comes much grief or sorrow. Okay? Because the more Solomon observed and the more he experienced, the more he saw the oppression, and in addition to all the other things he's described, he sees this. And once you see it, there are some things in life that once you realize the nature of things, can you ever unsee it? Okay, it's like a shattering of a mirror. Once it's shattered, you can't put it back together. And once you realize, or for lack of a better phrase, grow beyond that naivete that sometimes we like to have, I guess that innocence that a lot of times young people tend to have until they experience just how bad the world can be, then they realize, and that can never be fixed. It can never be changed. And this is what Solomon's observing, is that at least once individuals are dead, they don't have to experience that anymore. But what he goes on to say there in verse 3, yet better than both. So here's our three rankings, so to speak. You've got those who are living, or those who are dead are better than those who are living. But then in this third rank, if you will, those who have never been born. He says in verse 3, better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Is Solomon saying this for the sake of those who have never existed? Does that make sense? Someone who's never existed, can they gain any lessons from this? No. He's saying this for us. He's saying this ultimately for the purposes of the living. Because are the dead going to read his words? No. He's saying this for the purposes and the learning of the living. And as a result, when he writes this is not meant to be a discouraging point. This is not meant to be a matter in which people who read it just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, I'm in the least favorite group here of Solomon's. What's the point? He is saying that from the perspective of under the sun. Because from the perspective of simply, from mankind's experience, remember we talked about our five senses. That is the length of our experience. That is as far as we can go to experience this reality, this world. Well, as far as that goes, what we gain from this is the understanding that there is oppression and then there are the oppressed. Very rarely do you ever find anyone who's of the category that is neutral. Generally speaking, everyone's going to fall into one of those two categories. Whether they mean to or not, whether they have an understanding of it or not, generally people fall into one of those two categories. And so do we acknowledge, do we understand in our world that that continues to exist? Oppressed and oppressors? Okay, we have wonderful freedoms and wonderful liberties in our country. But there are countries where we can't even imagine, we can't fathom the existence. One time I got an email from a preacher who was preaching in China, but he had to send it, what people would say, in code. But as a Christian, when I read it, and I used to have it saved, and it might still be in my files in those boxes somewhere, but the way he wrote it in such a way that only a Christian could understand what he was talking about. Okay, he went swimming like a eunuch he once knew. Okay, reference to baptizing somebody. And then he named the churches were all named after a person from the Bible. But you, with the mind of a Christian, it really gave me a lot of insight into Revelation. But the mind of a Christian could understand it. But in that place, in China, these Christians, they could only whisper the hymns. They couldn't sing them out loud. They had to sneak together because they weren't allowed to congregate beyond a certain amount of number. Having Bibles, they had to hide them. I mean, these are types of places, and even beyond religious persecution simply based on gender or based on nationality, this exists in our world. And in many ways, we as Americans are sheltered from that type of existence. Typically, that's a good thing, but it also makes us very naive in some ways to the existence that others have to live. And it's that type of existence Solomon is observing, that on this earth, there are oppressed and there are oppressors. So what's the point? You have this power to oppress. When you die, is it going to do you any good? You have been one who has been oppressed. When you die, is it going to do you any good? No. Solomon is observing under the sun. Notice verse 4. He says, again I saw, verse 3, sorry. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. I wanted to point out the second time he uses that phrase in these first 3 verses. Under the sun. Because this is not a perspective of the Spirit or of God. This is the perspective of under the sun. Which is why he then goes back to vanity, verse 4. Again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. So within the text of observing that there are those with means and those without, those who can use that power, whatever that power may be, that whether they mean to or not can oppress others. In the end, the existence, regardless of what it is, under the sun, regardless of which category you fall into, the oppressed, they have no comforter, nothing to hold on to, because those with power are using it to oppress them. So then who should they turn to? Let's talk about not under the sun. Who then should the oppressed turn to? In this earth, they have no one, no comforter.
Philippians 4, cast all your care upon God.
Okay. Be anxious for nothing. With everything, with prayer and supplication, thanksgiving, let your requests, thank you, be made known unto God. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5, cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Those who are, and even beyond, oppressed. But throughout the New Testament, Jesus was referred to, even in the prophecies, the Messiah was referred to as leading free the captives. Those who were held captive, not necessarily physically, but spiritually. They had a comforter. We have a comforter. But didn't Jesus also say that it's easier for a camel to enter the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven? Was that you last Wednesday night? With Doug's lesson, he mentioned that context. Matthew 16? Right. Why is that? Why is it so hard for a rich man, quote unquote, to enter into heaven?
With their trust in those riches.
They put their trust, their comfort comes from under the sun, doesn't it? Which is what leads Paul to tell Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 to instruct the brethren not to be haughty or trust in uncertain riches, but to trust in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. So what Paul tells Timothy to remind those with means who are Christians is not to forget that your trust needs to be on God, not in your own ability or power. Because that's what man tends to take most comfort in, is what he has control over. But in the end, is control an illusion? Isn't control an illusion in the end? What do we have control over? What's the one thing in this entire universe that you and I have control over? Me. That's it. Even with vast amount of money or vast amount of friends in high places, do I really have control? No, it's an illusion. Because man so desperately wants to be able to control his own quote-unquote destiny, his own life. And we've built up, and really our society seeks this so much, especially in the absence of the influence of God's Word. But when we trust in God, are we okay understanding that I don't have control? Who is the anchor in the midst of the storm? God is. Okay. Who is the comforter? God is. And really, that's kind of the point that Solomon doesn't give us. He gives us these different perspectives of under the sun. He leaves absent the relationship to those not thinking under the sun. Those who think beyond the sun into the Spirit. So in many ways, he leaves the reader, our minds, to fill in what his point is. And that's the opposite of what he describes. Is under the sun, there's the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressor counts on his ability to control. The oppressed have no control. But the Christian understands that control is an illusion. It doesn't matter. Because God has all control. And I have to trust in him. Anything through verse 3. Verse 4. He saw all for all toil and every skillful work, man is envied by his neighbor. What does that mean? That the labor, the work, the toil, and notice he specifically says every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. The point of emphasis here is the envy. The fact that here's one individual, he's capable of doing things, and notice that term skillful. Maybe he has a specialty, something he's very skilled in, that the other is not. And he observed this man's ability to be a master craftsman. I've always admired people who are woodworkers, people who can build things. I'd love to be able to do that. Well, rather than envying someone, what should I do? If I really want to be able to do that, rather than envying one who can I not work and learn how to do it? I could. But you see, the human mind doesn't all the time work that way. We get jealous. We get envious. We view people who have more than what we have. In this case, particular abilities, particular skills, and sometimes the rewards that come from those particular skills. We observe it, and sometimes the first thing the human mind thinks of is how much they wish that they could have that. How jealous they are. They wish that they could be in that person's life. Doesn't this happen all the times with people and celebrities? Especially people of the world, okay? People who view the life of a celebrity and they daydream about what it must be like to have people constantly taking your picture. Or having people who are constantly dietitians who are making your food every day so you know exactly how many calories you're eating each day. Wouldn't that be nice if somebody's preparing that for you? You just eat it. You don't have to think about it. People who do your hair, do your makeup, whatever. All of that is done for you. But, of course, the downsides are legion. But this is part of what Solomon is observing. He says, this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. And notice what he says the very next verse. The fool folds his hand and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Verse 4 is related directly to verse 5 and 6. We have two different categories of people, the fool and what he's going to emphasize here, which is the wise, even though he doesn't use those words. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. What does he mean by that? He starves, and that's what the body does, right? When we don't eat, the body consumes itself. But why can't the fool eat?
He doesn't do anything to help the situation.
He doesn't work. He doesn't work. Instead, he fills his day with what? Envying his neighbor. That's the connection between verse 4 and 5. The fool folds his hands. Folding your hands. Sit there and watch. We would think of it maybe in terms of sitting in front of the couch and watching TV. That's not what Solomon has in his mind. The fool sits and watches his neighbor, and all of the toil of his neighbor, and the skill of his neighbor, and perhaps the rewards of that skill and of that work. And of course, that lesson we know is carried forward in the New Testament to the Thessalonians. He who doesn't work, neither let him eat. Which is to say that the motivation to work isn't necessary. It doesn't have to be for the work itself. Some people love what they do, and I admire that. Some people love the job that they do. They can go 8 to 5 all day, every day, because they love what they do, and that's a blessing. But there are some people, like my dad, he has never really enjoyed his job. But in fact, you could set his clock by him. He wakes up, even on Saturdays, his body is trained to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Every day he wakes up at 5 o'clock. And he's been doing this for decades and decades. And he's so good at what he does, but he doesn't like it. He doesn't enjoy it, but he is really good at it. The beauty of what Solomon describes here is that the foolish one, rather than gaining skill for themselves, finding their niche where they can fit to do a job, rather than actually putting in the effort, they just sit and watch. And ultimately they starve because they don't work for themselves. They don't, not to mention, we're not even talking about blessings of God and so forth. The fool refuses to work. We made a relation to when we discussed Thessalonians, where was it 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, where Paul makes that statement to the Thessalonians, he who doesn't work neither let him eat. And we talked about a phrase, even though it's not in the Bible, it is very sound. God helps those who helps themselves. And in this particular context, that's very true. Verse 6, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. There are two extremes to every situation, isn't there? On the one hand, you have the extreme of the fool who observes his neighbor, isn't really willing to do anything. He just watches and is jealous and is envious. It doesn't do any good. What's the other extreme that Solomon observes?
The one who does nothing but work.
Then you have the other one, both hands full. Both hands full of what? Yeah, of money, of means, of food. Better, you have this man who's got both hands full together with toil. And what else does Solomon say? And what? Grasping for the wind. Is Solomon condemning the prospect of preparing for retirement? Is he condemning putting in hard work until we can pay our bills each week or each month? Verse 4 says what?
He's envying. He's doing what envy is making him do, or he thinks making him do.
Jealous. Can someone who has, and here's an application I hadn't really thought about, can somebody who is skilled, who has the ability to make the means to support himself and his family, can he himself also be jealous and envious of those who have more than he does? Sure. In fact, in many ways, in our society, we're kind of ingrained to think that way, of constantly thinking about getting a promotion, of the next stage in my career. And because I'm getting a promotion, generally what comes with a promotion? More responsibility, but with more responsibility should come a raise, okay, or perks, better retirement. It's always a stepladder thing. Solomon isn't condemning having ambition. That's not what he's condemning. He's not condemning trying to make a better life for you or your family, or for that matter, to prepare yourself for retirement. That's not what Solomon's condemning. What he's condemning is making that your full focus, making that your priority, your aim under the sun. That's why he says, better a handful with quietness. Does any other translation here have a different word for quietness? Sorry?
In silence.
In silence, quietness, silence, tranquility. This term here, it is, quietness and silence goes with it in that, really, there's one word that the New Testament uses over and over again, contentedness. Can I be content and still look for and wish for a better job? Sure. Can I go through training and gain skills? Can I go to school and get degrees and still be content? Sure. Because, and it really has to do with my attitude and my focus, doesn't it? My focus and my attitude, if it's where it needs to be, where my life is not consumed with that pursuit of career, or for that matter, money, sure. I do what I'm trying to do to feed my family.
Be at peace with yourself.
This contentedness, this peace, this tranquility, this comes, and we've talked about this before in the New Testament, the term content or contentment, the term means I am sufficient for today. And the idea behind it is that God has made me sufficient today. I'm going to work for tomorrow. I'm going to work for next week. I'm going to work for the end of my life, for retirement. But today, God has given me what I need. I may not have everything I want. I may have a wish list of things on Amazon. Elizabeth, we've got wish lists for the kids for Christmas time, things that we see that we think the kids could use or whatnot. I've got a wish list. Elizabeth got a wish list. Things that those would be nice to haves someday if it goes on sale. But it's not stuff I need. I have everything I need today. And that acknowledgement that God has blessed me, remember we talked about joy. Joy is the understanding that God has blessed me. Joy and contentment always go hand in hand. That's why Solomon says, better a handful. Better a handful. With, huh?
How much is that?
It's the idea. Well,
I think of the word enough.
yeah. Well, enough in the sense that you're not overextending yourself to the point that your focus is now compromised. I think that's really what Solomon's observing here. It's not so much about how hard you work. It's about what your focus is. Because some people, do they have to work 60-hour weeks just to put food on the table? Some people do. This isn't about so much amount of time during the week you work or how hard you have to work, manual labor versus a desk job. It's about the focus. And it's about overextending yourself so much where you feel like you have so much responsibility and so many bills to pay that all of a sudden your focus is all about the money, it's all about the job, and it's not about God. And that's really what Solomon's point is. That's why he says, then both hands full together with toil grasping for the wind. Is that to say that the fool, that's not vanity and grasping for the wind? Really, we have two categories, two extremes of vanity and grasping for the wind. What's the one that isn't? Being content. Even if you still have to work 60-hour weeks. Even if you still have to work digging ditches. Okay. But make sure your priority is in the right place. All right, we will stop there. We'll pick up in chapter 4 and in verse 7 next week. Thank you, everybody, for thoughts and comments.